Alright, so we've got our sanded down board here. That's going to be the bottom of the tank. And what we want to do is seal this really well with epoxy. So we're going to use straight epoxy, not thickened or anything like that, and let it really seep into this wood. And we're going to do a couple coats of that, and then we're going to actually fiberglass this piece of wood after that. So to start out, we're just going to pump a ton of epoxy. Alright, that's probably pretty good. Now we'll get a popsicle stick from our little epoxy section here. And I guess I'll talk about this a little bit. I've explained this on the blog before, but never really in video. So I'm using a pretty decent size bucket here, and that's because I want this stuff to just be down on the bottom. I don't know if you can see that. I want it to be like a thin layer spread out on the bottom. The issue is if you start getting a thick layer in a small cup, it's a chemical reaction and it heats up and it cures way too fast. If you have a small cup and this epoxy is, sitting in, even something like this compared to this, it's thicker in there, same amount of epoxy, but thicker, and it heats up and it cures too fast. So that's not good. So really, the wider the base, the better. And what you want to do is kind of stir this real gently. You don't want a bunch of bubbles. For what we're doing, it's not that big of a deal if there's a bunch of bubbles, because we're going to brush it on and into this wood. But especially when you're like actually laying up fiberglass and you're going to maybe use some thickening agents and stuff, you don't want a bunch of bubbles. It can create little voids in the layup, and then it's just a pain in the butt. You have to go in and sand those out and fill them, and it's not ideal. So once this is all mixed up, you really want to mix it good. You want to make sure that the two parts of epoxy are evenly mixed really well. Now we'll find a brush. Do not know where my brushes are. Alright, found the brush. I usually keep a ton of these little disposable brushes around, and it looks like I'm running low. I only have a few left, so it wasn't quite as easy to find. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour this epoxy out and just brush it in here. You can use a popsicle stick or or really anything to move this stuff around. West System sells these little yellow ones, have up in there, but I don't like getting them too dirty if I don't have to. see, it's very well epoxied. We were careful to put lots of epoxy on the edges and you know, let it seep in. This is just plywood, so there's lots of little cracks and grooves, and we want to make sure that it seeps in there and seals up every little crack. And once this cures, we'll flip it over and we'll do the other side, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so this has cured. I was out there working on the foredeck, and this is completely cured. So we're going to peel it up off of this and do the other side. By the way, this blue cloth here is vacuum bagging cloth sold by Total Boat, and it's good stuff. You know, you can just peel it right off of the epoxy, so you can do stuff like this and not have to worry about the epoxy getting everywhere because it just peels right off. It's cheap too. I think this whole big thing, which is like as big as a bed sheet, is the same price as what West Systems gives you, and I think the West Systems is like this big, maybe even this big, and free shipping and all this other stuff. You know, I don't have any relationship with Total Boat, but they make good stuff. You can see it. I use all their stuff because it is the best price out there, and it's high quality. I've never been able to tell the difference of any of their products from West System. I love West System, but it's just way too expensive. I can't afford it. So, speaking of, let's mix some of this up. Can't remember how many pumps I did last time, but it was about perfect, so hopefully it was something like that. And you know what? I'm going to save this popsicle stick and mix with the brush this time. So I'm sure I spoke about this earlier, but just to reiterate, you know, the reason why you want to seal the wood like this is because wood naturally attracts moisture, and you know, especially for like something like we're doing, a water tank, but even for your bulkheads just in the boat, you know, the wood will expand and contract with just normal humidity changes. And the epoxy or fiberglass, like let's just take your hull, like your fiberglass hull that your bulkheads are tabbed into, is not expanding and contracting. And the wood is expanding and contracting. And so over time, many years, that wood will work its way loose from the fiberglass. And then you have what's called a floating bulkhead. And you'll notice these things a lot on older boats. if you actually go to some tabbing on your bulkheads and try to stick like a little like a flat knife, or you know, almost like a butter knife or something in there, you'll see that there's a little gap. It's not like the bulkhead's going anywhere, but it's not attached to the hull like it used to be, and that's not ideal. So if you seal up the wood like we're doing here, it will not expand and contract. You got to put like 3 layers on there, but once you've done it really well, the wood stays solid. And then when you tab it in as a bulkhead or as this tank bottom or whatever, it's going to be extremely rigid, especially this one. I mean, we're going to actually fiberglass this after a couple coats of epoxy. So it's not going anywhere. And that's an important consideration to make when you're dealing with wood on a fiberglass boat. Alright, there we have it. I'm just going to go around and make sure we got our edges really good. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. So what we'll do is we'll let this cure, and then we're going to need to just quickly sand it, just nothing crazy, but just kind of buff it out a little bit and run some Xylol over it, and then we'll be ready to put another layer of epoxy down and some fiberglass. Just so I don't forget, next time we might talk about this more, but the reason why you want to sand it and then rub it down with Xylol is because as this is curing right now, it's creating what's called blush. And blush is actually just like a wax, and it is a byproduct of the chemical reaction that's taking place for the epoxy to set up. And if you try to fiberglass on top of that, the fiberglass will not stick and adhere correctly. Eventually the fiberglass is going to kind of peel apart a little bit because that wax is going to be in between there. But if you sand it and then clean it really well with Xylol, then it gets rid of all that wax and you're good to go. You can apply the fiberglass and it's going to adhere really well.